Hello, dear friends. Welcome to another gathering of Spirit Reports of Life After Life on Kardec Radio. My name is Sunshine Beck. I'm a founding member of the Becerra Spiritual Healing Center in Penryn, near Sacramento, California. And I'm also the founder of Divine Light Spiritist Center in Nevada City, California. We're in Northern California. And I'm excited to be here to talk about heaven and hell and spirit accounts of life after life. So, dear friends, last week we looked at the three main parts that we consist of. We obviously know we do have a body. We can touch it, we can see it, we can feel it. And then we have a part of us that's the soul, which is the immortal part of us. The body falls off after a while, and we inhabit a new body in a new incarnation. So the body is transitory, our soul is immortal. The soul is surrounded by a subtle body, which is a little more dense than the soul, but less dense than the body. It's pretty much the link between the soul and our body, and that's called the perispirit. And why are we mentioning that again? Well, it becomes important when we look at our transition from this life to the life after this life, our quote-unquote death. Because why? Because our soul and the perispirit travel together. They stay together and go from lifetime to lifetime. They go from this life to life after life and into another incarnation. While as we know, our body keeps changing. Our body falls off when one incarnation is complete and we inhabit a new one in a new incarnation. So last week we also looked at the subject of suffering during our transition. Now we all know that most likely we're a little scared of our transition because of pain. And we did learn that there is most often some pain involved in the transition. And why is that? That is because the perispirit, which we just learned, the link between our soul and our physical body, is still potentially connected to our body when we transition. And the more our perispirit is connected to our physical body when we are about or when we are transitioning, the more pain our soul will feel. We also learned that the soul is what feels pain. However, the body is the instrument of the pain. The other thing is so the pain before the excarnation that we just mentioned happens before the excarnation. But there is another phenomena, and that is the so-called confusion. The confusion sometimes starts already before the transition and very often continues after our transition. And it may take any time from a few minutes to an hour to several years, as a matter of fact. And this kind of confusion, we learned, creates another set of pain for the soul. Now, how can we counteract? How can we prepare to have less pain during our transition? In other words, how can we prepare that our perispirit and our bodies are not so tightly linked anymore? And also, what can we do to hopefully minimize or maybe even avoid the state of confusion, which, as we said, may start before the transition, but very often continues after our transition? Well, the good news is what we can do is work on our moral development. So it is our inner transformation that helps us to transition with more ease and less pain. And that is something that we can start right now. We can de-emphasize our material lives, our material goods that we surround ourselves with, and link ourselves and connect ourselves more and more with the spirit world. And we can help ourselves by educating ourselves. And that is what we're doing by meeting every Sunday night, by reading Heaven and Hell, and as a matter of fact, all the Spiritist books that we have at our disposal. And another thing we can do to help ourselves is to think about our transition, to remind ourselves that our bodies will not be around forever. So we kind of prepare ourselves daily a little bit for our transition. And we're reminded of Thought and Life by the Spirit Emmanuel through Chico Xavier, who said in chapter 10, we must seek goodness, we must feel goodness, we must visualize goodness, and mold goodness with all the resources we can muster. That is a pretty strong statement, but it gives us a recipe of what we can and should most likely do every single day. Turn our whole life, starting with our minds, around towards the good, doing the good, charity, benevolence, indulgence, forgiveness. So before we start our first case tonight, I want to look and see all the friends who have joined. I've seen a lot of them, and I just want to say hello to everyone before we continue. There is Tony. Hello, Tony. Nice to see you. Welcome. And Yara Gouveia, wonderful to see you. Welcome, welcome. There's Nora Brazil, also so welcome, so happy to have you. Teresa Castro, welcome, Teresa. And I love the rainbows. And there's Demir Pacheco, hello, welcome as well. And who else? Nora Brazil, Teresa. Yes, we need to raise our morality right now. We can do it every moment with our thoughts and turn them towards the good. And there's Karina Lisi, wonderful, welcome as well. And La Souza, hello everyone, so nice to have you all. Welcome, welcome, welcome to Kardec Radio, and I want to say we're so grateful to Kardec Radio that we have this beautiful classroom every Sunday night and so many more classrooms during the week and every week. And thanks to the good spirits and Vanessa Anzalone who started this endeavor, we can meet and have a platform to learn, to work on our moral transformation. So thank you so much. All right, so today we're starting with chapter 2 of Heaven and Hell by Allan Kardec. And now we're diving deep into different cases, different spirits who report back to us how they experienced their transition, how much pain did they experience, and what happened to them, what happens to them after their transition. Did they experience any confusion? We're so excited, we can't wait to hear. So our first case is Mr. Sanson. Well, in the English language it would probably be Sanson, but since he was a Frenchman, I'm guessing his name was Sanson. And he is one of the happy spirits. Allan Kardec categorized the cases of the spirits that are reporting back to us into different categories. And the first one, we're so delighted, is a happy spirit. So let us start lightly and happily today. So Mr. Sanson was a former member of the Parisian Spiritist Society. So he was a spiritist. And he died in 1862 after a year of cruel suffering. So we take note. He was a spiritist and he had a full year of cruel suffering. He foresaw his end and he asked the society's president via a letter to invoke him as quickly as possible. And here's what he said. Please, here's what Mr. Sanson says to the president of his Spiritist Society. He says, please evoke my spirit as soon as possible and as often as is convenient for you, so that having been a sufficiently useless member of our society during my stay on earth, I may be of at least some use beyond the grave, by providing you the means of studying step by step through evocation the various circumstances resulting from what is commonly called death. And we call it transformation, we in Spiritism. So in other words, Mr. Sanson did not consider himself to be a very useful spirit in a Spiritist society, but he's asking to be invoked as quickly as possible after his transition, so that he's hoping he can be of use to the rest of us and the people of his Spiritist society at the time, to help them and us with our own transition so we can learn. He sounds like a very humble spirit, doesn't he? So he's essentially, we know the word autopsy, and when we hear the word autopsy, we usually think of our physical form, correct? But Mr. Sanson is actually helping us with his spiritual autopsy, a new word which is quite interesting, because yes, we have a spirit, soul, and a body, so of course we would have an autopsy both for the spirit as well as for the body. And tonight we will be focusing on the spiritual autopsy of Mr. Sanson with his own help. So in order to satisfy his desire of being evoked very quickly after his passing, a group of people from the Spiritist Society in Paris went to the mortuary right after his passing, and they, in the presence of the body and an hour before his funeral, his burial, invoked Mr. Sanson. And why did they do that? So they did it in the mortuary, let's just picture that, in front of his motionless body. And why did they do that? Well, they did it because they wanted to fulfill his last request. By the way, for those of you who would like to follow me along in Heaven and Hell, we are in part 2 of Heaven and Hell, chapter 2, Happy Spirits, Mr. Sanson, which is the first case, on page 233. It might help you, for those of you who are more visual, so you can read along a little bit. Hello, Hippolito. It's so nice to have you. Welcome, welcome. So the group went to the mortuary. Why? Well, they wanted to fulfill Mr. Sanson's request of being invoked as quickly as possible after his transition. And they also wanted to see one more time what actually the soul was experiencing right after death. And they wanted to see that with a man who was very intelligent, Mr. Sanson. He was a very intelligent man during his earthly days. He was enlightened, and he lived his life. He was convinced by Spiritist principles. So that characterizes Mr. Sanson for us. Now, the cases we will be visiting in the future, you will see, are very, very different. It's kind of like live TV, right? You never know who we're going to get the next week. But this particular one has those parameters. So with perfect lucidity, Mr. Sanson described the moment of his transition when he was evoked now. He had been able to witness his own death and rebirth into the spirit world, which is an unusual circumstance that was due to the elevation of his spirit. So let us repeat and let us take note. So Mr. Sanson was intelligent, he was enlightened. We're guessing he worked on his moral transformation during his lifetime, and he was educating himself about what transition meant. We're guessing that because of how his transition actually happened. And we learned earlier that it is the moral transformation that helps us most and foremost. And he lived according to the Spiritist principles. So he ended up being completely lucid, and he was able to describe his transition. So there doesn't seem to be, we'll learn a little bit more, this state of confusion that he experienced. And he was able to be a witness, a lucid witness of his transition. All right. Now, it was a few days later It was right then his first evocation. Remember, at the mortuary. I apologize. It was right here at the mortuary before his burial. And the group asked Mr. Sanson, "You had suffered so much that I thought we might ask you how you feel now. Do you still feel your pain?" Because remember, he had a whole year of pain while he was still incarnated. "What sensations are you experiencing in comparing your present situation with that of 2 days ago?" Well, here's Mr. Sanson's answer. "My situation is quite happy, for I feel none of my former pain. I have recovered and am renewed, as you used to say. My transition from earth life to the spirit life might have made everything incomprehensible at first, because we sometimes remain many days without recovering our lucidity. But before dying, I prayed to God, asking Him to allow me to speak to those whom I wish well. And He heard me." So we're getting a clue for us. Praying is something else that will help us. Praying not only helps us in our current life with different life situations, with the vicissitudes of life, but we're now learning that prayer before we transition, we can actually ask for something we would like to have happen, may help us tremendously. Because Mr. Sanson tells us that he prayed for lucidity, and it seems like he experienced it. Then the group continues to ask, "How long did it take for you to recover your mental lucidity?" So how long did it take him, they're asking. And Mr. Sanson answers so precisely, it's impressive. 8 hours. So even it took him 8 hours to regain his lucidity right after his transition. "I repeat," Mr. Sanson continues to say, 8 hours, God, I repeat, has given me proof of His goodness. He deemed me more worthy than I actually am, and I could never thank Him as I should." Remember, he prayed to be lucid, and God gave him lucidity after 8 hours. The next question for Mr. Sanson: "Are you sure that you no longer belong to our world, namely the incarnate world? If so, how can you prove it?" Interesting question. The group now wants to know whether he knows that he is a discarnate and how can he prove it. And he says, "I feel strong and robust, transformed, in a word. You would no longer recognize me as the old invalid who had to avoid everything, to abandon every pleasure and happiness. I am a spirit. My homeland is the expanse of space, and my future is God, who radiates throughout the immensity of it all." So Mr. Sanson is very clear that he is a spirit now. He feels strong and he feels connected. He feels connected to God, and he sees the spirit land as his homeland and vast and connected to God. As you may have noticed, for those of you who have heaven and hell in front of you, we're not reading the whole entire, not every single word, but picking out the most important questions and parts of the answers. But of course, you're invited to read the whole thing afterwards, if you like. Then the group continues to ask, "How does seeing your body here affect you?" So they're wondering that Mr. Sanson, who is a spirit now, and they're sitting in front of his dead body, how does it impact Mr. Sanson to speak to them in front of his physical form that is not part of him any longer? Well, Mr. Sanson answers, "My body, my poor and miserable remains, must return to dust, but I will always have a fond memory of all those who held me in esteem while incarnate, I look upon that poor, decomposing flesh, the dwelling place of my spirit, my trial for so many years. And I say, thank you, my poor old body. Thank you, my poor old body. You have purified my spirit. My suffering has been a tenfold blessing and has earned me a well-deserved place. That is why I have been able to communicate to you so soon. So let us see what we're learning here. So Mr. Sanson tells us that he kind of, between the lines, tells us that he's not attached to his body anymore. But he is incredibly grateful to his body because he sees his body as a vehicle for his purification. And it sounds like via pain, because he says, my suffering has been a tenfold blessing. So while being in his body, he sees the suffering he experienced during his lifetime as an incarnate. This suffering actually was a blessing. And he says a tenfold blessing. And that is something that we may take to heart. Because most of us have gone through suffering, are potentially currently going through suffering, and may experience more suffering in our lives. And it is so comforting, I want to say, to remind ourselves, to get this beautiful message from a spirit, to remind ourselves that suffering is actually ultimately our purification and our blessing. As Jesus told us in one of his Beatitudes, he said, Blessed are the afflicted. It is when we are suffering that God grants us the opportunity, allows us to expunge through our physical form, our body, past wrongs. So now we know that the suffering actually helped Mr. Sanson and will help us too. The next question the group is asking Mr. Sanson, did you retain your awareness up to the last instant? What they mean, was he lucid up until his transition? Because remember we said often or sometimes the state of confusion already starts before the transition. So now let's see what Mr. Sanson experienced. Yes, he says, my spirit retained its faculties. I no longer saw, I foresaw. How beautiful. Just imagine, once we reach a point that we don't only see with our physical eyes anymore, but we can actually see beyond. Our capacity enables us to foresee. Very poetic, I think. My entire life unfolded within my memory, he continues to say, and my last remembrance, my dying request, was to be able to communicate with you as I'm doing right now. All right. So since Mr. Sanson lived a life according to Spiritist principles, he must have worked on his inner transformation. He was able to be lucid. He was able to no longer see with his eyes only, but foresee, and was able to go through his life via his memories. The next question. Were you conscious at the moment in which your body breathed its last? What happened to you at that time? What sensations did you feel? I love the precision of those questions. Isn't it wonderful? Because it really helps us to, it's literally the spiritual, autopsy, right? It takes apart all the little facets, and we can learn, and we can start and prepare right now. So the answer is, life expires, and sight, or rather the spirit's sight, darkens. You find yourself in the void, the unknown, and then, as if carried by an unknown power, you find yourself in a world where all is joy and wonder. Now let us keep in mind, this is Mr. Sanson's experience, and by no means everyone's. He was a prepared spirit. But this is what may expect us if we prepare ourselves. So he says again, the spirit sight darkens, but you find yourself in the void, the unknown, and then, as if carried by an unknown force, you find yourself in a world where all is joy and wonder. I no longer felt anything, nor was I sure about what was occurring. Nevertheless, an ineffable happiness surrounded me, and I no longer felt the grip of pain. So Mr. Sanson shed his pain. He was in a state of void, but he felt joy and wonder. He felt surrounded by joy and wonder. He was not really sure what was occurring, but it was a happy state he found himself in. Let us continue now with on page 236. Allan Kardec tells us, during the ceremony at the cemetery, Mr. Sanson dictated the following words. Remember, this first invocation that we just completed happened at the mortuary in front of his dead body, right before his burial. And then during the ceremony, his funeral, his burial at the cemetery, he, right there at that moment, Mr. Sanson dictated the following words. He was pretty busy, wasn't he? He was really interested in passing on the information. And we thank him. We thank him from the bottom of our hearts, because this is how we learn. Imagine, like almost 150 years later, and we're still completely spellbound by the account that Mr. Sanson gave us. He truly was availing himself to be of service to this day. So he dictated the following words. May you no longer fear death, my friends. Thank you. It is only another step for you if you have known how to live well. It is full of happiness if you have worthily deserved it and have completed your trials well. I repeat, courage and goodwill. One cannot enjoy a lot of things, he says, do not assign more than a mediocre value to earthly possessions, and you will be rewarded. One cannot enjoy a lot of things without depriving others of their well-being, thereby morally committing a great evil. May the earth lie lightly upon me. So again, here he's teaching us a lot. Now let's look at it. Let's go back, because we really need to remember, right? So we can practice and we can do it correctly during our lifetimes. So he invites us not to fear death. He says it's just another step in our evolution. It's a transition. And it will be a transition full of happiness, according to Sanson, if we have worthily deserved it and completed our trials well. Well, what do you think he may mean by completing our trials well? Well, we're thinking that if we see the blessings in our trials, if we live our lives in gratitude versus complaining, that we don't feel as victims of our lives and people that are in our lives and circumstances, but that we know that everything that we are encountering in our lives is for our own good, for our own soul transformation, for our own soul development. And it is actually only the harvest we are reaping after the seeds we planted potentially lifetimes ago, but possibly also in this lifetime. So learning about Jesus' teachings, learning about the Beatitudes, blessed are the afflicted, really understanding it, how to live a righteous life, a life with right thinking, how to learn the importance of our thoughts and the impact it has not only on our own bodies but on everyone we're touching, educating ourselves, practicing charity, turning our lives around towards the good. All of this is what Mr. Sanson, we're guessing, what we're assuming Mr. Sanson means, because that is really what Spiritism teaches us. The Spiritism via the good spirits teach us. He also tells us courage, to have courage, and goodwill, which reminds us of the definition that the illuminated spirits give us in the Spirits book when Allan Kardec asks for the definition of charity. And the definition of charity, the answer was for this question, it is benevolence, it is indulgence towards the imperfection of others, benevolence towards everyone, indulgence towards the imperfection of others, and forgiveness for the incomprehension of others. And when we take the word benevolence apart, there is our goodwill that Mr. Sanson recommends to us. Because bene is good, and volere is the Latin, is a word from the Latin origin, means will, goodwill, which means we're seeing the good in everything. And then he tells us something else that's really important and for us to take to heart, is to not have too many earthly possessions and not take them too seriously, not to attach ourselves too much to materialism, because it is exactly that attachment that attaches our physical form more closely and tightly to our perispirit and vice versa, which will allow us, I want to say, to experience more pain during our transition. It is the materialization of this connection of our lives that will make it hard for us to quote-unquote die. So he says that we cannot enjoy a lot of things without actually depriving others. So this is something really important for us to take to heart, to remember in our everyday life and practice detachment. The second invocation happened 2 days later. So here, Margarita, thank you so much. We're thanking you for being here. Thank you for watching. And so the second evocation happened 2 days later after his burial. And here's the first question for Mr. Sanson at that point. Since an erroneous idea, no, this is the wrong one, sorry, question 4, page 237 for those of you who would like to follow along. You have described your passage from life to death very clearly, Mr. Sanson. You said that at the moment in which your body breathed its last, your life expired and your spirit sight darkened. Was that moment followed by any kind of painful sensations? And here's Mr. Sanson's answer. Certainly. So, yes, he had some painful sensations. Certainly, he says, because life is an incessant sequence of pain, and death is the complement to all of it. A violent rupture occurs as though the spirit has to make a superhuman effort to escape its envelope, the body. It is this effort that absorbs our whole being and renders us unconscious of the transformation we are experiencing. So this is Mr. Sanson's experience, right? But then we have a little footnote here that puts what he says into perspective. And we're going to read it because it says, this is not the general rule. So this is important information for us. So what Mr. Sanson explained here was the rupture that occurs, and it's like a superhuman effort to escape the envelope, and it's this effort that absorbs our whole being, all of this, right? It says this is not the general rule. Experience has shown that many spirits do in fact lose consciousness before death, but that among those who have arrived at a certain degree of spiritualization, the separation occurs without effort. So this is important for us. So we need to keep in mind that most of us will not be lucid. Most of us will show a loss of consciousness. And it is not everyone who has lived a life like Mr. Sanson, who must have worked on his dematerialization during his lifetime to prepare for himself for an easier transition. So if we don't do that work, we will have a harder time. The next question. Do you know if there are spirits who suffer more at that time of the transition time? Are there spirits that suffer more than you, Mr. Sanson? They're asking. For example, is it more painful for materialists, for those who believe that everything ends at death? Wow, interesting. Let's see. Maybe we are a materialist and we want to know what happens, right? It's never too late to make a shift and change our modus operandi during life. The answer by Mr. Sanson. Absolutely. Because spirits who have prepared themselves beforehand have already forgotten their suffering. That is, they have become used to it, and they await death with serenity, with which they await death. They await death with serenity, which keeps them from suffering. So if we prepare ourselves, and we learned before, we work on our moral transformation, we dematerialize our lives, we pay less attention to all the material goods around us, we de-emphasize that, we educate ourselves, we turn our lives around and practice the good, starting with our thoughts. And all of this will help us, prevent us from suffering. And as a result of this preparation, we know what is in store for us. Mental suffering, he says, is the most painful, and not having to bear it at the time of death is a big relief. But now we know. Now we know how we can prepare ourselves. Right, friends? This is another step in the right direction. And this is education that helps us. And what I really like is we can actually by just always focusing on our inner transformation, not only help ourselves in our lives, in our current lives, but also our future lives, because we will be putting more delicious seeds into our gardens, but we will also help ourselves to have an easier, less painful, more lucid transition. So it's almost like, I don't like this saying, but it keeps coming into my mind, we can kill several birds with one stone. A vegan friend of mine said once to me, Sunshine, I'm vegan, so I'm knocking coconuts down the tree with one stone. I like that better. So we're saying we can knock several coconuts down the tree with one stone, right? By just practicing inner transformation. So then we have another occasion. And on that occasion, different spirits gave us the following picture of the death of disbelievers. So those that do have no idea, who may not even know that there is life after life. These are more materialistically inclined people. So here's what they tell us, what happens to those disbelievers during the transition time and after. In their final moments, they say, hardened disbelievers experience the anguish of those dreadful nightmares in which you see the rim of a precipice and are about to fall into it. You make a futile effort to escape, but without success. At such times you want to cling to something, to find a point of support, but you feel yourself slipping away. You want to cry out, but cannot articulate any words. And that is why you see dying persons writhe and wring their hands and moan in agony. Sure signs of a nightmare in which they now find themselves. In the ordinary nightmare, waking up frees you from the desperation and you feel happy at realizing it was just a dream. The nightmare of death, however, often goes on. And here's the shocker. Sometimes for years, we learn here. And what makes the sensation even more painful for the spirit is the utter darkness in which it sometimes finds itself immersed. I don't know about you guys, but I certainly don't want to experience that. So this really puts fire under me to do more of the good, to work harder on my inner transformation. Because who wants to go through all this, right? This pain, the nightmare, the demise, the darkness. I mean, I'm sure we all have had nightmares like that where we want to scream, we can't, or we fall from heights, and it's just not pleasant. And to imagine that this may take years, All right, so thank you, Allan Kardec, for bringing this information to us, correct? So here's the next question. You said that at the moment of death you could not see, but that you could foresee, Mr. Sanson. No longer being able to see with your corporeal eyes is understandable, but before your life finally gave out, could you already glimpse the brightness of the spirit world? Interesting question. Let's see. Here's Mr. Sanson's answer. It is like I said earlier. The instant of death renders the spirit clairvoyant. The physical eyes can no longer see, but the spirit, which possesses a much deeper sight, instantly discovers an unknown world. The truth suddenly appears before it, temporarily granting it a profound joy or inexpressible sadness, depending on the state of its consciousness and how it remembers its last life. So again, if we prepare ourselves, it will be a happy moment, a moment where we will feel relieved. And when we look back to our lives, to our past life, with a clear conscience and peaceful mind. And in order to have that experience and not suffer after our transition with remorse and regret or intense attachment to our material goods we had to leave behind, to save ourselves that suffering, we can start today to prepare ourselves. And now we know how, correct? So now we can start. The next question they're asking. Would you tell us, Mr. Sanson, what impressed you most at the moment in which your eyes reopened to the light? If possible, would you describe how things looked to you? Mr. Sanson. When I came to and saw what was there in front of me, I was dazzled at first and couldn't perceive things very well, since one's lucidity doesn't return all at once. Remember, it took him 8 hours. But God gave me profound proof of His goodness by enabling me to recover my faculties quickly. I saw that I was surrounded by many faithful friends. That's another very important piece of information. We do have friends in the spirit world, and the faster we regain our lucidity, the more we will be surrounded by love. People, spirits we recognize, like our faithful friends. Mr. Sanson continues, all the protector spirits who came to assist us were smiling around me, and an unequaled happiness animated them. It sounds like a very warm moment. I felt strong and well disposed, and was able to travel easily through space. There are no words in the human language that can express what I saw next. Sounds like a beautiful state. We would like to experience that. He says, I will return to you in order to speak more fully of all my blessedness, but without going beyond the limits set by God. So this is something we often experience in the Spirit's book as well, that at this point in our evolution, we will not be granted to know and see everything. And it sounds like Mr. Sanson experienced some things that he's not able to share with us at this point yet. But he gives us a beautiful recipe, and now it comes. You should know, however, Mr. Sanson tells us, that happiness as you understand it is only a fiction. Live wisely and virtuously in the spirit of charity and love, and you will be prepared for the sensations that even your greatest poets could not depict. And we repeat that. And if you want to follow along, page 240 in the middle of the page. Beautiful recipe for success. Yet another ingredients for the perfection, for the perfect cake we're baking, that is called the perfect transition. So here he says, live wisely and virtuously. What is the highest virtue of all that combines all virtues? Do you know? If you like, you can post. I'll continue, and after the sentence we'll tell you. Live wisely and virtuously in the spirit of charity and love, and you will be prepared for the sensations that even your greatest poets could not depict. Yes, it is charity. The highest virtue is charity. And we know charity defined as benevolence towards all, indulgence towards the imperfection of others, and forgiving everyone, including and first and foremost ourselves. And it all starts with our thinking. So now we have yet another tool in our toolbox, another ingredient for our recipe. So then, here is another piece of information, another evocation. And this one is focused on the perispirit. Question: under what appearance have spirits shown themselves to you? Under the human form? So now the group is curious to see how Mr. Sanson experienced those, he told us, faithful friends and protective spirits. How did they appear to him? Did they look human? We would like to know too. Let's see. He says, yes, my dear friend, the spirits have taught us that in the other world, spirits retain the transitory form they had while on earth. A difference, however, is between the crude apparatus that used to drag itself heavily along under the weight of its trials and the wondrous fluidity of the spirit body. So he tells us, he teaches us that yes, the spirit carries a form from his previous lifetime, mostly. But it is not as crude, the apparatus of the perispirit, as our physical form here on earth, but it is more a fluid body, a much lighter fluid body. And remember, it is the soul surrounded by the perispirit that is the unity that travels from lifetime to lifetime. And that is why we would like to know what happens. How does the perispirit show up during life after life, right? Ugliness no longer exists, Mr. Sanson tells us. For the features have lost the harshness of expression that forms the distinct character of the human race. God has sanctified all these gracious bodies as they move about with great elegance of form. And the language here has intonations that are untranslatable to you. Sight possesses the depth of a star. Sounds like a beautiful poem, doesn't it? Yes, so we know that the perispirit is fluidic, it's graceful, it's elegant, and that the language intonation is untranslatable for our senses, to our senses, and that our sight will possess the depth of a star. The next question: how do you see yourself, Mr. Sanson, with a limited, circumscribed, albeit fluidic form? Do you have a head, torso, arms, and legs? Yes, we would like to know that too, correct? So let's see. Mr. Sanson answers, the spirit, having retained the human yet divinized and idealized form, of course displays all those features. So yes, he says, A head, a torso, arms and legs are part of the fluidic body, the perispirit. I feel my legs, he says, and toes perfectly well. For if we want to, we can appear to you and squeeze your hands. Just now I squeezed my friend's hands, though they didn't perceive it. Our fluidity enables us to be anywhere without taking up space and without causing any sensations in people. And he says that light passes right through the perispirit. It's a sweet thought. We imagine our spirit mentors, our spirit friends, the benevolent spirits around us, how often they may squeeze our hands or pat our head, right? And maybe more often than not, we don't even feel it. But a perispirit can do that, and light goes right through it. Spirit sight cannot be compared to human sight, he continues on to say. The spirit possesses a divine perceptiveness that grasps everything. It can even guess your thoughts. In addition, it can take any form that would be the most suitable for awakening your memories. So this is another interesting piece, that a perispirit can change its form. Most often, a spirit uses the perispiritual form that is most closely related to the physical form of its previous life. But here we're also learning that doesn't always have to be so. That actually the spirit has the opportunity, the option to change its perispiritual form depending on what sensations they want to evoke. If perhaps a different physical perispiritual form is needed at a certain time, they have the faculty to actually produce that. The next question. Spirits don't have gender. This is a question. Nevertheless, since it has only been a few days since you were a man in your new state, do you have a nature that is more male than female? Yes, we would like to know that. Now, is there male and female perispirits on the other side? Does the same thing apply to a spirit who left its body a long time ago? And here is the answer by Mr. Sanson. And of course, we keep in mind that these are answers by Mr. Sanson, one spirit, and that the actual experience may be more vast than what we're learning today, right? But this is a lot of this actually mirrors the information we get to know in the André Louis series of books and also in the Spirits book. So here's the answer. The question was, does a spirit have any gender? The answer. We don't have to be of a male or female nature. Spirits do not reproduce. Spirits do not have a gender. And he continues on, there's an explanation underneath of it that's not from Mr. Sanson, but most likely from Allan Kardec, and it says, purified spirits understand their new situation perfectly well, but among the less evolved, there are many who still believe they are under the same conditions as on earth, and who hold on to their old passions and desires. Some still regard themselves as male or female, and that is why it is sometimes said that spirits have gender. So now we know, when we hear or we see a male or female gender, it is either because the spirit is more evolved and would like to show him or herself in that fashion so that we can recognize them better, but it can also be for a less evolved spirit that they're still so attached to the role play of male and female, and so they may actually still believe that they are a man or a woman, in other words, male or female. So this is interesting information, right? So then, another question for Mr. Sanson. You said you can read our thoughts. Would you explain how this transmission of thought works? And here we are bumping up against our limitations. Here's the answer. Mr. Sanson says that would not be easy. So to explain of how the spirits can read our thoughts, how it mechanically works out, is not so easy. We know we get more information in the André Louis books, and we can refer to them. But they were also written a little bit later. And this book is about 150 years old, the information. And Mr. Sanson, who is only one spirit, we have to keep in mind, he is an evolved spirit, but yet nevertheless, he's just one spirit who is reporting back to us. He says it's not so easy, but he does make an attempt. Let's look at that. It would be necessary to open up an arsenal of new elements to you, about which you would have to know everything that we know. And we don't, right? That would be impossible, since your faculties are limited by matter. Patience, he says, become morally better, and you will comprehend everything. So there is a silver lining in our cloud of limitation, I want to say. We can be patient, and we can keep working on our inner transformation, which will help us to develop the faculties to eventually learn. He says, the air that surrounds you, which is as intangible as we are, receives your thoughts. Your very breath, so to speak, is the written page of your thoughts. These pages are read and commented on by the spirits who are constantly near you. They are the messengers of a divine telegraphy that none can escape. So this is as far as he goes in his explanation, and that is already very interesting, isn't it? And it reminds us again of Thought and Life by Emmanuel, where we learn that our thought is our life. As we think, we emit, and as we emit, we attract. And that we are always living, we're swimming, so to speak, in a pool of our own thoughts. And we're always under the influence of the pools of thoughts that are being emitted by other incarnates and discarnates. So the picture is actually bigger than we may actually consider in our day-to-day life. But here, Mr. Sanson helps us along and confirms. He says, the air that surrounds you receives your thoughts, because it's an energy that we transmit, and it goes into the air. Your very breath, so to speak, is the written page of your thoughts, and that these pages the spirits can read. And since they're constantly around us, they are the messengers of a divine telegraphy. Those thoughts in the air and the words we express, that we expel, that can be read like a telegraph. And no one can escape them. So I remember once our friend Vanessa Anzalone telling us in one of the many study groups that with our thinking, we can't draft. And I really thought about it, and it's really true. The minute we think we can't, it's out here, it's in the air, it's transmitted. It's already too late. We can't retract it. We can't get the eraser and say, oh no, never mind, I'm gonna unthink that thought. We can maybe sometimes do it with words, right? But with thoughts, there is always just a thought. And it's there. It plants a seed. And it has not only an impact on ourselves, but everyone else around us. And that pertains to the spirits as well. And now we're learning that this is one aspect, how the spirits are actually reading our thoughts. So, there is a spirit. This completes actually the invocation of Mr. Sanson. And here's, just to wrap it up, a spirit by the name of Georges, who says, in summary, Mr. Sanson, it was the death of a righteous man, that is a peaceful death, full of hope. How few are those who make that difficult passage in such a way. How few are those who, after life's illusions and disappointments, perceive the harmonious rhythm of the spheres. And he says that most spirits do not experience such a harmonious, lucid, relatively pain-free transition as Mr. Sanson. But he says for those spirits who are more material than Mr. Sanson was, he says, pray for such souls. Pray for all who suffer. Charity is not restricted to the people you can see. It helps and consoles the beings who populate the spirit world as well. This is an important sentence here. Charity is not restricted to the people you can see. We can help people. We can help spirits, incarnates, both discarnates and incarnates, any moment. And we can do it through a good thought, through connecting our thoughts with God's thoughts, by prayer, via praying. Love knows no bounds, the Spirit George tells us. Thus love, which is deeper than the sea and more infinite than space, should bind all of you in one and the same communion of charity. So, another recipe, another guideline for us. We can help ourselves and all suffering spirits, both incarnate as well as discarnates, and that includes us, through prayer, through inner transformation, working on our inner transformation, through following what Emmanuel tells us, to take that to heart, to put it on our mirror as a reminder. We must seek goodness. We must feel goodness. We must visualize goodness. We must mold goodness with all the resources we have, 24/7 and all the time. We must practice charity, to be benevolent, indulgent, and forgiving. And think about our transition daily, to prepare ourselves, to educate ourselves. And that is what we're doing. Next week, we will be continuing on with another case from Heaven and Hell. And we'll surprise you which case that will be. And we will learn more. So I hope we'll reconvene in a week. And let us, for a moment, close our eyes, if we are in a position to do so, if we're not driving, and let us connect with our hearts and minds, with the good spirits, with God, our Mother, Father God, the first cause of all things, our beloved Jesus, our guide and model, our mentors, the mentors of our groups, our benevolent helper spirits, the healing doctors, Dr. Allan Kardec, Mr. Sanson, Chico Xavier, all the good spirits who have served us so much by bringing this vital information to us, so that we know how to prepare ourselves for our transition, to live a happier life and to experience a happy transition into the spirit world. And with so much gratitude, we ask humbly to close tonight's study session, and so be it. Dear friends, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts for being here. We're learning alongside of us and the spirits who attended our gathering. We'll see you next week. Many blessings. Enjoy. God bless you. Bye-bye.